Montana Territory, 1871. The vast prairie stretched like an ocean of golden grass beneath a sky so wide it made a man feel small. It was the kind of country that swallowed people whole, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Here, a man learned quickly that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. At least, that was what Ryker Newell told himself. The 26-year-old rancher squinted against the afternoon sun, his lean frame silhouetted against the distant crazy mountains. His face, handsome despite the weariness etched into it, wore the weathered look of someone who had seen more than his years warranted. The light stubble on his jaw couldn't hide the tension in his expression as he surveyed the boundary line of his modest ranch. Another year, another fight, he muttered to his horse, a chestnut gelding that had been his only consistent companion for the past 3 years. Ryker had built Evergreen Ranch from nothing but determination and calloused hands, after returning from the war between the states with nightmares and a belief that had solidified during those blood-soaked years. Getting attached to people only guaranteed pain when they were taken away. The frontier was no place for tender feelings. Out here, a man survived by keeping his heart as hard as the ground beneath his boots. He had convinced himself that the isolation was preferable. 60 acres, a small herd of cattle, and a 2-room cabin were all he needed. No wife to leave a widow, no children to leave fatherless when the harsh Montana winter or some desperate outlaw finally claimed him. The locals in the nearby town of Whitewater Springs had stopped trying to marry him off to their daughters, recognizing the resolute loneliness in his eyes. Yet sometimes, in the silent pre-dawn hours when even the coyotes had gone quiet, an emptiness would settle in his chest that no amount of hard work could fill. Those were the moments when Ryker would ride harder, work longer, anything to outrun the whispers that said maybe, just maybe. His careful isolation wasn't strength but fear. Today was not for such thoughts. With drought threatening and cattle prices dropping, Ryker needed to focus on survival. The bank loan was coming due and he was short on cash. The trip to Helena to sell some stock couldn't wait another week. "We leave tomorrow at first light," he told his horse, patting its neck before turning back toward his cabin. He never made it there. The gunshot cracked across the valley like thunder, sending birds scattering from a nearby cottonwood. Ryker's horse startled beneath him, and he instinctively dropped low in the saddle, hand moving to the Colt revolver on his hip. A second shot followed, and this time he could tell it came from the direction of the creek that bordered his property to the east. Against his better judgment, Ryker spurred his horse toward the sound. If rustlers were on his land, he needed to know. If it was the Blackfoot passing through, though they rarely came this far south anymore, he'd rather face them directly than wonder. What he found at the creek bank was neither. A small wagon lay overturned in the shallow water, one wheel spinning lazily in the air. A team of horses, still harnessed but entangled in the reins, struggled at the edge of the water. And there, standing in the creek with her skirts hiked up to her knees and a small pistol clutched in her trembling hands, was a young woman Ryker had never seen before. Her hair, the rich brown of autumn chestnuts, had mostly escaped what must have been an elegant arrangement, falling in damp waves around a face that would have stopped conversation in any saloon from Montana to Texas. She couldn't have been more than 20, yet there was a determination in her stance that made Ryker pause. "Stay back," she called out, raising the pistol as she noticed his approach. "I already shot once to warn you." Ryker raised his hand slowly. "Ma'am, this is my land you're standing on. I heard shots and came to investigate." The young woman's green eyes widened slightly, but the pistol didn't waver. "Your land." "You're not one of them." "One of who?" Ryker dismounted carefully, keeping his movements slow and his hands visible. She hesitated, studying him with a wariness that spoke of recent fear. Finally, the pistol lowered an inch. "The men who ran us off the road, they took my father." It was then that Ryker noticed the blood on her sleeve and the tears in her once fine traveling dress. This was trouble, plain and simple, the very kind of entanglement he'd spent years avoiding. The smart thing would be to point her toward town and ride the other way. Instead, he heard himself asking, "Are you hurt?" "Not badly," she straightened, dignity pulling her shoulders back despite her bedraggled appearance. "I'm Violet Summers. My father and I were traveling to visit my uncle's claim near Helena when 3 men stopped our wagon. They took my father, but I managed to escape when the wagon overturned during the struggle." Ryker's jaw tightened. Road agents had been growing bolder in the territory, but kidnapping was a new development. How long ago? "Less than an hour. I've been trying to free the horses, but..." She gestured helplessly at the tangled harness, then suddenly swayed on her feet. Acting on instinct, Ryker splashed into the creek, reaching her just as her knees buckled. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face and the gash on her forehead that was still seeping blood. "Miss Summers," he said, steadying her with hands that suddenly felt too rough against the fine fabric of her sleeves. "You need a doctor." "No," she said with surprising firmness, her eyes focusing again. "I need to find my father. You won't be much help to him if you blade to death first." Ryker made his decision, though everything in him warned against it. "My ranch is closer than town. We'll get you patched up, then figure out who took your father and why." Violet Summers looked up at him, vulnerability and strength battling in her expression. "And who exactly are you, sir?" "Ryker Newell, and it seems, Miss Summers, that your trouble just became mine." He didn't add what he was thinking. That trouble always seemed to follow when you let people get too close, and that by this time tomorrow he'd make sure she was someone else's concern. The young woman settled into Ryker's cabin with a composure that surprised him. After helping her from his horse and awkwardly ushering her inside, he'd left her with his limited medical supplies while he tended to her horses and secured what belongings he could salvage from the overturned wagon. When he returned, he found her seated at his rough-hewn table, her wound cleaned and bandaged with neat precision, her hair somewhat tamed, though still damp from the creek. "You have a lovely home, Mr. Newell," she said, with a politeness that seemed oddly out of place in his Spartan cabin. Ryker glanced around at the single room that served as both kitchen and living area, seeing it through her eyes for the first time in years. The unadorned walls, the minimal furnishings, the complete absence of anything that might suggest comfort or permanence beyond necessity. "It serves its purpose," he said shortly, setting down the carpetbag he'd retrieved from her wagon. "Found this, didn't know if it was yours." "Yes, thank you." Her relief was palpable as she reached for it. "At least I'll have something dry to change into." Ryker cleared his throat. "You can use the back room. It's not much, but there's a bed." "I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and will," he said more firmly than he intended. "You've been through enough today without arguing over sleeping arrangements with a stranger." Something like amusement flickered across her face. "Are we still strangers, Mr. Newell? You've rescued me, retrieved my belongings, and offered me shelter. Where I come from, that at least qualifies you as an acquaintance." Despite himself, Ryker felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Where exactly do you come from, Miss Summers?" "Philadelphia, originally." She ran a hand self-consciously over her rumpled skirt. "My father was a professor at the university there. When my mother passed last year, he decided we needed a fresh start. My uncle wrote about the opportunities in Montana Territory, so here we are." Her voice faltered slightly. "Or here I am, at least." The shadow of grief that crossed her face stirred something uncomfortably like empathy in Ryker's chest. He recognized that particular pain all too well. "Your father's still out there," he said, more gently than before. "And first thing tomorrow, I'll ride to town and alert the sheriff. Road agents don't usually take prisoners unless they want something." They kept asking about papers, my father's research papers. "He's been working on a geological survey that he believes will help identify new mining opportunities." She twisted her hands together. "I don't understand why anyone would care enough about academic work to kidnap someone." Ryker did. In a territory where fortunes were made and lost on mining claims, information about potential gold or silver deposits was worth more than its weight in either. "Did your father bring these papers with him?" "Yes, they're in his valise, which was in the wagon, but I didn't see it when." Her eyes widened suddenly. "You think that's what they're after?" "Seems likely." Ryker moved to the stove, needing something to do with his hands. "I'll make us something to eat and then you should rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough." As he busied himself with the simple task of preparing a meal, he was acutely aware of her presence behind him. It had been years since anyone other than the occasional ranch hand had sat at his table, years since the sound of a woman's voice had filled the empty corners of his home. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked after a moment. "No," he said automatically, then regretted the curtness in his tone. "Just sit, you've been through enough today." To his surprise, she laughed, a soft, genuine sound that seemed to change the very air in the cabin. "Mr. Newell, I may be from Philadelphia, but I'm not helpless. I did manage to fire a warning shot and escape 3 armed men today." Ryker turned to find her already on her feet, moving toward him with determined grace despite her ordeal. "I'm quite capable of setting a table at the very least." Their eyes met, and for a moment Ryker found himself at a loss for words. There was something in her gaze, a resilience, a warmth, that unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. "Plates are in that cupboard," he said finally, turning back to the stove. They worked in a strangely comfortable silence, moving around each other as if they'd done this dance before. By the time they sat down to a simple meal of beans, biscuits, and coffee, Riker had almost forgotten that just hours ago, he'd been planning a solitary trip to Helena, certain that entanglements with others only led to pain. "Almost so," Violet said, breaking the silence after several minutes. "You never told me how a man from, I'm guessing by your accent, Kentucky, ended up with a ranch in Montana territory." Riker stiffened slightly. He'd spent years deflecting such questions from well-meaning neighbors and curious travelers. His usual response was a noncommittal grunt or a change of subject, yet something about her direct gaze made the practiced evasion stick in his throat. "Virginia, actually, and it's not much of a story." He took a long sip of coffee. "War ended, didn't have anything to go back to. Headed west like countless other fools looking for a fresh start." She considered this, her expression thoughtful. "And did you find it, your fresh start?" The question, simple as it was, cut closer to the bone than he'd expected. Had he found a new beginning, or merely a different kind of ending, a slow, quiet fading away in this remote corner of the world? "Found 60 acres and more work than one man can handle," he replied, avoiding the heart of her question. "What about you? Philadelphia to Montana is quite a change." Violet's smile turned wistful. "It wasn't my choice initially, but after Mother died, well, Father needed the change and I needed to be there for him." She set down her fork. "He's all I have left." The raw emotion in her voice resonated in a way Riker didn't want to acknowledge. He knew all too well what it was to lose everything, to have your world narrowed down to a single point of connection. "We'll find him," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Thank you," she met his eyes directly, "not just for saying that, but for everything. You didn't have to help me today." Riker shifted uncomfortably under her grateful gaze. "Anyone would have done the same." "Would they?" Violet tilted her head slightly. "I've traveled enough of this territory to know that's not true. Kindness to strangers isn't as common as one might hope." "It wasn't kindness," he said, more harshly than he intended. "It was basic decency. And tomorrow I'll ride to town, alert the sheriff about your father, and arrange for you to stay somewhere more suitable until this is resolved." She studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing across her face. "Of course," she said finally, "tomorrow you'll be rid of me and things can return to normal." The words were spoken without bitterness, yet they hung in the air between them like an accusation. Riker pushed back from the table, suddenly needing space. "You should get some rest," he said, gathering their plates. "Take the back room. There are extra blankets in the trunk if you need them." Violet rose gracefully, though he could see the exhaustion in the slight droop of her shoulders. "Good night, Mr. Newell, and despite your protests to the contrary, I do recognize kindness when I see it." Before he could respond, she had taken her carpetbag and disappeared into the back room, leaving Riker alone with thoughts he'd rather not examine and a strange hollow feeling that had nothing to do with hunger. Tomorrow, he told himself firmly. Tomorrow he would ride to town, hand this problem over to the proper authorities, and return to his solitary existence. It was better that way, safer. The soft sound of movement from the back room, the rustle of fabric, the creak of the bed frame, reminded him of just how long it had been since another presence had disturbed the silence of his home. Riker moved to the front window, staring out at the darkening landscape. Out there somewhere was a man who might be dying while his daughter slept under a stranger's roof. Out there were men desperate or greedy enough to kidnap for the promise of wealth. And here he was, a man who had spent years convincing himself that caring about others was a weakness he couldn't afford, suddenly finding himself responsible for a young woman whose very presence seemed to challenge everything he'd built his life around. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Morning arrived with a harsh brilliance that seemed at odds with Riker's troubled mood. He'd slept poorly on the floor by the stove, his mind racing with plans and concerns he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. By the time the first pale light crept through the windows, he was already up, making coffee and mentally rehearsing what he would tell Sheriff Morgan in town. The soft sound of the back room door opening made him turn. Violet stood in the doorway, and the sight of her momentarily stole his prepared greeting. She had changed into a simple blue dress that brought out the green in her eyes, and though her face still showed strain, there was a composed dignity in her bearing that seemed remarkable given the circumstances. "Good morning," she said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I hope I haven't overslept. Sun's barely up, Riker replied, pouring her a cup of coffee. How's your head? She touched the bandage gingerly. Better, thank you. I changed the dressing this morning. An awkward silence fell between them as she accepted the coffee and took a seat at the table. Riker busied himself with preparing a simple breakfast, aware that they were both deliberately avoiding the subject of what would happen next. Finally, as he set a plate of biscuits before her, Riker cleared his throat. I'll be heading to town as soon as we've eaten. Sheriff Morgan is a good man. He'll organize a search party for your father. Violet's fingers tightened around her cup. I'm coming with you. Miss Summers. Mr. Newell, she interrupted, her tone polite but firm. My father is missing. I will not sit idly by while others search for him. I can identify the men who took him, and I may be able to help make sense of which papers they might be after. Riker frowned. It's a hard ride to town, and you've already been through an ordeal. I've endured worse, she said simply, and something in her steady gaze told him this wasn't mere bravado. He studied her for a moment, recognizing the same stubborn determination he often saw in his own reflection. Fine, he conceded, but we'll need to leave within the hour if we want to make it to town and back before dark. Relief visibly washed over her. Thank you, I promise I won't slow us down. As they ate breakfast, Violet surprised him by asking practical questions about the local terrain and which routes the kidnappers might have taken. Her analytical approach revealed an intelligence that belied her refined appearance. Father always said I should have been allowed to attend university alongside the men, she explained, catching his expression. He taught me much of what he knew about geology and map reading. Your father sounds like an unusual man. A genuine smile touched her lips. He is, after Mother died, he said life was too short for arbitrary limitations. He believes knowledge belongs to whoever has the mind to pursue it, regardless of gender. Her expression clouded, which is why I need to find him. His work could be important for this territory. Riker nodded, finding himself unexpectedly impressed. We should get going. I'll saddle the horses while you gather your things. Outside, the morning air was crisp, with the promise of another hot day to come. As Riker prepared his horse and a gentler mare for Violet, he tried to focus on the practicalities ahead rather than the woman who had upended his carefully isolated existence. When she joined him, carpetbag in hand and a determined set to her jaw, he was struck again by the incongruity of her presence against the rugged backdrop of his ranch. She looked like she belonged in a Philadelphia drawing room, not on the back of a horse heading into potential danger. Yet when he offered his hand to help her mount, the strength in her grip told a different story. She settled into the saddle with unexpected ease, arranging her skirts with practiced efficiency. I've been riding since I was 7, she explained, noting his surprised expression. Father believed a woman should be as comfortable on horseback as in a parlor. Your father and I might actually get along, Riker said, swinging into his own saddle. The ride to Whitewater Springs took nearly 2 hours, during which Violet proved herself to be both a capable rider and an observant companion. She asked intelligent questions about landmarks they passed and listened intently to Riker's brief explanations of the surrounding country. As they approached the outskirts of town, Riker became increasingly aware of the attention they would draw. He rarely came to town except for supplies and never in the company of a young woman. The gossip would start before they even reached the sheriff's office. People will talk, he warned her as the first buildings came into view. Violet's expression remained serene. Mr. Newell, I appreciate your concern for my reputation, but at the moment, my only concern is finding my father alive. Something like respect stirred in Riker's chest. Fair enough. Whitewater Springs was a growing town by Montana standards, boasting a main street lined with wooden storefronts, 2 saloons, a hotel, and various businesses catering to the surrounding ranches and nearby mining operations. As they rode down the main street, Riker noted the curious glances and outright stares directed their way. Mrs. Peterson, the shopkeeper's wife, actually stopped sweeping her porch to gawk as they passed. Riker tipped his hat stiffly, already regretting the questions that would follow. The sheriff's office was at the far end of the street, a solid building with a small jail attached. As they dismounted and tied their horses, the door opened, and Sheriff Thomas Morgan stepped out, his weathered face registering surprise at the sight of Riker. Well now, Newell, twice in 1 month. Must be some kind of record, he said, his eyes moving curiously to Violet. Sheriff, Ryker nodded. This is Miss Violet Summers. She needs your help. Her father's been kidnapped on the road from Helena. Morgan's expression immediately shifted to concern. Miss Summers, please come in. When did this happen? As they followed the sheriff inside, Violet launched into a clear, detailed account of the previous day's events. Ryker found himself watching her with growing admiration. There was no hysteria, no excessive emotion, just precise information delivered with the calm determination he was beginning to recognize as her natural state. 3 men, you say? Morgan frowned, making notes. Can you describe them? The leader was tall with a scar along his jaw. He wore a black hat with a silver band. The second man was heavyset with a red beard. The third stayed mostly with the horses, but he had a distinctive blue bandana. Morgan and Ryker exchanged a look. Sounds like the Harmon gang, the sheriff said grimly. They've been causing trouble up and down the territory for months now, started with stage robberies, moved on to claim jumping. This is the first kidnapping I've heard of, though. They were specifically after my father's research papers, Violet pressed. They seemed to think his geological surveys would lead them to a significant mineral deposit. Your father's a geologist, Morgan looked interested. Professor at Philadelphia University. He's been conducting surveys for the territorial government and several private investors. The sheriff rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That explains it. Word is the Harmons have been trying to get ahead of the mining companies, jumping claims before they're officially registered. If they have Professor Summers and his research, Ryker added, they could identify valuable sites before anyone else knows about them. And my father would never willingly help criminals, Violet said, her composure finally showing cracks of fear. Which means they might. They'll keep him alive as long as they need his expertise, Morgan said quickly, perhaps sensing her rising distress. The question is where they would take him. Ryker leaned forward. The old Wilkins mine would be my guess. It's abandoned, remote, and has shelter. Perfect place to hole up while they force the professor to interpret his findings. Morgan nodded. Good thinking. It's about half a day's ride north of here. He stood, reaching for his gun belt. I'll gather a couple of deputies and head out within the hour. I'm coming with you, Violet said, rising as well. Miss Summers, Morgan began, his tone gentle but firm. This is no job for a lady. These men are dangerous. Best you stay in town at the hotel until we return with your father. Violet's spine straightened. With all due respect, Sheriff, my father's research is complex. You'll need someone who understands it to determine what the kidnappers might be after and how to approach them. She has a point, Tom, Ryker found himself saying, surprising both the sheriff and himself. And she can identify the men more quickly than we can. Morgan looked between them, his expression dubious. It's dangerous territory, and these aren't men who play by any rules. I understand the risks, Violet said steadily. But I won't sit safely in a hotel room while my father's life hangs in the balance. The sheriff sighed, recognizing the determination in her voice. Very well, but you'll stay back when we approach the mine, and you'll follow orders without question. Understood. Perfectly. Morgan turned to Ryker. And you, will you be joining us, or is your involvement concluded now that you've delivered Miss Summers to town? The question hung in the air, weighted with more than just the immediate circumstance. It was a challenge to the careful isolation Ryker had maintained for years. The smart answer, the safe answer, was to wish them luck and ride back to his ranch. He had a loan payment due, cattle to tend, and a journey to Helena planned. Getting involved in a potentially deadly confrontation with outlaws was exactly the kind of entanglement he'd sworn to avoid. Yet when he looked at Violet, something shifted in his chest. The thought of riding away while she faced danger alongside strangers felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. I know the country around the Wilkins mine better than most, he said finally. I'll ride with you. Relief flickered across Violet's face there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. Good, Morgan nodded. We'll meet back here in an hour. Miss Summers, you might want to visit Pearson's store for some riding clothes. What you're wearing isn't suited for where we're going. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, Ryker felt the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. He had just volunteered to risk his life for people he barely knew, contradicting every principle he'd lived by since the war. You don't have to come, Violet said quietly as they walked toward the store. You've already done more than could be expected of a stranger. Ryker glanced down at her, struck again by the quiet strength in her bearing. We're not exactly strangers anymore, Miss Summers. A small smile touched her lips. No, I suppose we're not. As they navigated the curious stares of the townspeople, Riker realized with unsettling clarity that Violet Summers had somehow broken through defenses he'd thought impenetrable. And the most disturbing part was that he wasn't entirely sure he minded. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the small party made its way toward the abandoned Wilkins mine. Sheriff Morgan led, followed by two deputies, Johnson and Webb, with Riker and Violet bringing up the rear. True to her word, Violet had exchanged her blue dress for a practical riding skirt and blouse purchased from Pearson's store, and she handled the rough terrain with remarkable composure. Riker found himself impressed by her endurance. They had been riding for nearly 4 hours through increasingly difficult country, yet she hadn't complained once, not even when they forded a shallow but swift-running creek or navigated a treacherous rocky incline. "How are you holding up?" he asked during a brief rest stop, offering her his canteen. "Well enough," she replied, accepting the water with a grateful nod. Though her face was flushed with heat and exertion, her eyes remained clear and determined. "We must be getting close." "Another hour, I'd say." Riker surveyed the rugged landscape ahead, where the foothills began their gradual climb toward the distant mountains. "The mine's tucked into that first ridge of hills." Sheriff Morgan approached them, his expression grave. "We'll need to be more careful from here on out. The Harmons likely have a lookout posted." "What's the plan when we reach the mine?" Violet asked. "Johnson and I will approach from the main entrance. Webb will cover the back exit. Newell, I'd like you to find a vantage point and keep watch over the whole operation." Morgan glanced at Violet. "Miss Summers, you'll stay with Newell until we've determined it's safe." Riker expected her to protest, but she simply nodded. "And if they try to use my father as leverage?" "Then we negotiate," Morgan said firmly. "Our priority is bringing everyone out alive." As they remounted and continued their journey, Riker found himself increasingly aware of Violet's presence beside him. There was something about her quiet determination that resonated with him, reminding him of a time when he'd believed in causes greater than mere survival. They rode in companionable silence until the terrain became too rough for conversation, requiring all their concentration to navigate safely. When they finally reached a sheltered grove about a half-mile from the mine, Morgan signaled for them to dismount and secure their horses. "We'll proceed on foot from here," he said in a low voice. "Newell, that outcropping to the west should give you good visibility of the entire area. Take Miss Summers and establish your position. Johnson, Webb with me." As the three lawmen moved stealthily toward the mine, Riker led Violet toward the rocky formation Morgan had indicated. It required a short but steep climb, and Riker found himself automatically offering his hand to assist her over the more difficult sections. "I can manage," she said softly, though she accepted his help nonetheless. When they reached the top of the outcropping, they were rewarded with a clear view of the mine entrance and the small clearing before it. A thin trail of smoke rose from a campfire near the boarded-up entrance, confirming that someone was indeed using the abandoned site. "Two horses," Riker noted, scanning the area with narrowed eyes. "Should be three if all the Harmons are present." "Maybe one of them is out scouting," Violet suggested, her voice tense. "Or inside with your father." Riker retrieved a small spyglass from his saddlebag and studied the camp more closely. "I can see one man by the fire, heavy-set, red beard." "That's one of them," Violet confirmed, her hands clenching at her sides. "The second man." Riker handed her the spyglass. "Take a look." "Can you see anything else?" She peered through it carefully, her breath catching suddenly. "There's a saddlebag near the entrance. It looks like Father's." Below them, Sheriff Morgan and his deputies had split up, taking positions around the mine as planned. The tension in the air was palpable as they waited for the law officers to make their move. Riker found himself studying Violet's profile as she kept watch. The afternoon light caught the rich chestnut tones in her hair, and despite the gravity of the situation, he couldn't help but notice the elegant line of her neck, the determination set in her jaw. "You're staring, Mr. Newell," she said without lowering the spyglass. Caught, Riker cleared his throat. "Just making sure you're holding up all right." A faint smile touched her lips. "I believe we're beyond such polite fictions by now, aren't we?" Before he could respond, movement below caught their attention. Sheriff Morgan had emerged from his cover and was approaching the camp openly, his badge clearly visible, while his deputies remained hidden with weapons ready. "This is Sheriff Morgan from Whitewater Springs," his voice carried clearly in the still afternoon air. "I'm looking for the Harmon brothers." The man by the fire jumped to his feet, his hand moving toward his gun before he seemed to think better of it. "What's your business, Sheriff?" "I think you know, you're holding Professor Summers against his will. I'm here to bring him back safely." A tense silence followed, during which Ryker shifted slightly to better shield Violet, his hand moving to his revolver. "Don't know what you're talking about," the bearded man called back, though his nervous glance toward the mine entrance betrayed him. "We have witnesses who saw you and your brothers take him from his wagon yesterday," Morgan replied steadily. "Now we can do this the easy way, with everyone walking away alive, or—" The crack of a rifle shot cut through the air, and Morgan dove for cover as dirt kicked up at his feet. Ryker instinctively pulled Violet down behind the rocks as another shot rang out from somewhere to their right. "The third man," he muttered. "He must have been patrolling the perimeter." Violet's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "Where is he? Can you see him?" Ryker cautiously raised his head for a better view. The situation below had erupted into chaos. The bearded man had drawn his weapon and was exchanging fire with Deputy Johnson, while Morgan was pinned down behind a boulder near the mine entrance. "There," Violet whispered suddenly, pointing to a rocky outcropping about 100 yards to their right. "I saw a flash of blue, his bandana." Ryker followed her gaze and caught a glimpse of movement as the hidden gunman adjusted his position. "Good eye. He's trying to work his way around to flank the sheriff." Without hesitation, Ryker drew his revolver. "Stay down, I need to warn Morgan." "Wait," Violet clutched his arm, her eyes wide with sudden fear. "You can't just expose yourself to that rifle." "I don't intend to," Ryker's mind worked quickly, assessing angles and distances, "but I can create enough of a distraction for Morgan to spot him." Before she could protest further, Ryker took careful aim at a cluster of rocks near the hidden gunman and fired. The shot startled the man enough to make him shift position, revealing his location more clearly. Morgan, alerted by Ryker's shot, immediately spotted the threat and signaled to Webb, who began working his way toward the rifleman. "Smart thinking," Violet admitted, her grip on his arm relaxing slightly. Below them, the firefight continued. The bearded man had retreated into the mine entrance, still exchanging shots with Johnson. Morgan remained pinned down, unable to advance without exposing himself to fire from either the mine or the hidden rifleman. "This is bad," Ryker muttered. "Your father's still in there, probably with the third brother." "If this turns into a siege, they might use him as a hostage." Violet's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we need to create another distraction." Ryker turned to her incredulously. "Miss Summers, I agreed to bring you along as a guide, not to put you in the line of fire." "And yet here we are," she countered, her green eyes flashing with determination. "My father's life is at stake, and I don't intend to sit idly by if there's something I can do to help." Ryker studied her for a long moment, recognizing the same stubborn courage he'd seen in soldiers who refused to abandon wounded comrades under fire. It was a quality he'd once valued above all others before disillusionment had taught him the cost of such loyalty. "What did you have in mind?" he asked finally. "The mine has a ventilation shaft," she said, pointing to a small opening about 20 yards up the hillside from their position. "Father mentioned it when he described similar mines to me. Most of these operations needed additional air circulation beyond the main entrance." Ryker followed her gaze, impressed despite himself. "You think we could use it to get inside?" "Not we," she said firmly. "Me, I'm smaller and lighter. I could make it through without making much noise." "Absolutely not," Ryker said flatly. "I'm not sending you into a mine filled with armed outlaws." "I'm not asking permission, Mr. Newell." Her voice was calm but unyielding. "I'm simply informing you of my plan and hoping for your assistance." The echo of gunfire punctuated their standoff, reminding them both of the urgency of the situation. Ryker ran a hand through his hair in frustration, recognizing the determined set of her jaw. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he muttered. "So I've been told." A faint smile touched her lips. "Will you help me or not?" Ryker sighed, knowing he was going to regret this. "Fine, but we do this my way. I'll create a distraction to draw attention away from the shaft. You slip in, locate your father, and get out. No heroics." "Agreed." "And take this." He handed her his revolver, keeping only his hunting knife for himself. "Do you know how to use it?" "Father insisted I learn." She checked the chambers with practiced ease. "5 shots left." Use them only if absolutely necessary, Riker warned. The sound will echo in the mine and give away your position. They waited for a momentary lull in the gunfire before carefully making their way toward the ventilation shaft. Riker's heart hammered in his chest, not for his own safety but for hers. The realization that he cared what happened to this woman he'd known for barely a day was both unsettling and somehow inevitable. When they reached the shaft, Riker examined it critically. It was narrow but should be wide enough for Violet to squeeze through. The real question was where it led inside the mine. Be careful, he said, unable to keep the concern from his voice. These old mines aren't stable. Violet nodded, suddenly looking very young despite her determined expression. If I'm not back in 20 minutes. I'll come after you, he finished for her. Their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the risk they were both taking, not just physically but emotionally. For a brief moment, Violet reached out and squeezed his hand, the simple gesture conveying more than words could have. 20 minutes, she repeated, then turned and began lowering herself into the shaft. Riker watched until she disappeared from view, a hollow feeling spreading in his chest. Then he squared his shoulders and moved to carry out his part of the plan, trying not to think about how quickly this woman had become someone he couldn't bear to lose. The ventilation shaft was narrower than Violet had anticipated, forcing her to inch her way forward on her stomach, the rough stones scraping against her clothing. The darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by occasional thin streams of light filtering through cracks in the rock. Despite the confinement, Violet forced herself to remain calm, focusing on her breathing and the thought of her father somewhere ahead. She had meant what she said to Riker. She would not sit idly by while others determined her father's fate, even if it meant crawling through the bowels of an abandoned mine with a borrowed revolver tucked into her belt. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only a few minutes, the shaft began to widen and angle downward more steeply. Violet could hear faint echoes of the gunfire outside, oddly distorted by the mine's acoustics, along with another sound, voices. She paused, straining to listen. Two men were arguing, their words indistinct but their tone unmistakably angry. One of them had to be the Harmon brother who had first captured her father, the tall man with the scarred jaw. The other, her heart leaped as she recognized the measured cadence of her father's voice. He was alive. The shaft ended abruptly in a crude grate made of rusted metal bars. Beyond it, Violet could see a portion of a larger chamber dimly lit by a lantern. Carefully, she tested the grate and found it loose in its moorings, years of neglect having weakened its attachment to the surrounding stone. Outside, a sudden increase in gunfire told her that Riker had begun his distraction. Taking advantage of the noise, she pushed against the grate until it gave way, setting it aside as quietly as possible before sliding through the opening. She found herself on a narrow ledge about 6 feet above the floor of what appeared to be a storage room. Crates and mining equipment lay scattered about, covered in years of dust, except where recent footprints showed that the outlaws had disturbed the abandonment. The voices were clearer now, coming from an adjacent chamber. Moving cautiously, Violet made her way to the partially opened door separating the rooms. "You're running out of time, Professor," a harsh voice growled. "The sheriff and his men aren't going to wait forever out there. Tell me which claim numbers match these survey points, and maybe you'll live to see your daughter again." "I've told you repeatedly," her father's voice replied, weary but defiant. "These surveys are preliminary. The potential claims need further investigation before anyone can be certain of their value." "You're lying," something crashed against a wall. "Your notes specifically mention high-grade ore deposits in this region. All I need are the exact locations." Violet peered through the crack in the door. Her father sat on a crude wooden chair, his hands bound before him, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled from his ordeal. Despite this, his bearing remained dignified. Facing him was the scarred man she remembered all too vividly from the attack on their wagon. Between them on a rough table lay her father's papers, maps, and notebooks, the research that had brought them to Montana territory and had ultimately led to this dangerous situation. "Even if I gave you what you want," her father was saying, "you'd have no reason to keep me alive. I'm not a fool, Mr. Harmon." The outlaw leaned forward menacingly. "Maybe not, but you do have a weakness, your daughter. My brother Jeb is out there right now, and he has orders to find her if anything happens to me. So unless you want her to suffer for your stubbornness—" "Your brother Jeb," her father interrupted with surprising calm, "is likely dead or captured by now, given the gunfire we've been hearing." Harmon's hand flashed out, striking her father across the face. "Enough, you have one more chance, Professor. The claim numbers now, or I put a bullet in you and take my chances with the notes alone." Violet's blood ran cold as she saw the outlaw draw his pistol. Her father remained stoically silent, his eyes never leaving his captor's face. Time seemed to slow as Violet weighed her options. Riker's revolver felt heavy in her hand as she raised it, knowing that if she fired, the noise would alert the bearded brother at the entrance. If she missed, her father would die instantly. If she hesitated, he might die anyway. In that moment of crystallized fear, she remembered something her father had taught her years ago during her first shooting lesson. Aim with your mind, not just your eye. Know what you intend before you pull the trigger. Her intention was clear: save her father, stop the man threatening him, get them both out alive. With a steadiness that surprised even her, Violet pushed the door open and stepped into the chamber, the revolver aimed unwaveringly at Harmon's back. "Step away from my father," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Both men turned in shock. Her father's face registered disbelief followed by alarm. Violet, no. Harmon recovered quickly, a slow smile spreading across his scarred face. Well, now, the daughter comes to the rescue. His gun remained pointed at her father. "Put that down, girl, before you hurt yourself." "I know how to use this," Violet replied, advancing slowly into the room. "And I know that at this distance I won't miss." "Neither will I," Harmon's smile vanished. "So we have ourselves a standoff. I shoot your father, you shoot me. Nobody wins." "Actually," came a new voice from behind Violet, "nobody shoots anybody." Ryker stepped into the chamber, his hunting knife pressed against the throat of the bearded outlaw, who walked before him with his hands raised. "Sheriff's got your other brother in custody," Ryker continued conversationally. "Seems he wasn't much for fighting once he was outnumbered, threw down his rifle and surrendered." He nodded toward Harmon. "Your turn." Gun on the table, nice and slow. For a tense moment, Harmon seemed to consider his options, his eyes darting between his captive, Violet, and Ryker. Then, with a curse, he lowered his weapon and placed it on the table. "Wise choice," Ryker said, his expression grim. "Miss Summers, would you mind untying your father while I keep our friends here company?" Violet hurried to her father's side, tears of relief finally breaking through her composed exterior as she worked at the ropes binding his wrists. "How did you find me?" Professor Summers asked softly as she freed him. "I was certain they had killed you when the wagon overturned." "I escaped," she explained, helping him to his feet. "Mr. Newell found me by the creek on his property." She glanced gratefully at Ryker, who was now binding the Harmon brothers' hands with their own belts. "He's been indispensable." Her father studied Ryker with keen interest. "Then it seems I owe you my daughter's life as well as my own, sir." "You owe me nothing," Ryker replied, his usual gruffness softened by the obvious reunion between father and daughter. "It was Miss Summers who insisted on coming after you. Crawled through a ventilation shaft with my revolver and faced down an armed man without flinching." There was unmistakable admiration in his voice. "I've seen battle-hardened soldiers with less courage." A commotion at the mine entrance interrupted them as Sheriff Morgan and Deputy Johnson burst in, weapons drawn. "Everyone all right in here?" Morgan called out, then relaxed visibly as he took in the scene. "Well now, Miss Summers, seems you found a way in after all." "With Mr. Newell's assistance," she replied modestly. As the sheriff took charge of the prisoners and Johnson checked Professor Summers for injuries, Ryker moved to Violet's side. "You disobeyed my instructions," he said quietly. "No heroics, remember." "I recall no heroics," she replied, a hint of a smile playing at her lips despite her exhaustion. "Merely a daughter ensuring her father's safety." Ryker shook his head, but there was no real reproach in his expression. "You're either the bravest or the most foolhardy woman I've ever met. I haven't decided which." "Perhaps both," she admitted, "though I suspect the same could be said of you, Mr. Newell." Their eyes met, and for a moment the chaos of the mine rescue fell away, leaving only a connection neither had expected to find in such circumstances. The moment was broken by Professor Summers approaching, supported by Deputy Johnson. "Sheriff Morgan says we should return to town immediately. He's concerned the Harmons might have other associates in the area." Ryker straightened, his expression becoming more reserved. "He's right. We should move out while we have daylight left." As they made their way out of the mine into the late afternoon sun, Violet found herself watching Ryker as he conferred with the sheriff about the safest route back to town. There was something about the way he carried himself, a natural authority tempered by consideration for others, that contradicted his professed desire for isolation. She wondered what had driven such a man to seek solitude in the Montana wilderness, and why the thought of returning to that solitude after today's events filled her with an unexpected sadness. When they reached the horses, Ryker insisted that Professor Summers ride double with him, as the older man was too weakened by his ordeal to safely manage a mount alone. The simple consideration of the gesture only deepened Violet's curiosity about the complex man who had come to her aid. As the party began the long ride back to Whitewater Springs, Violet found herself hoping that tomorrow would not, in fact, be the day Ryker Newell withdrew back into his isolated existence. For reasons she wasn't quite ready to examine, the thought of him riding away filled her with a sense of loss entirely disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. The return journey to Whitewater Springs was made in relative silence, the tension of the day giving way to exhaustion as they put distance between themselves and the mine. Professor Summers rode before Ryker, occasionally engaging in quiet conversation about the territory and Ryker's ranch, while Violet rode alongside, frequently checking on her father's condition. By the time they reached town, night had fallen, and the streets were quiet except for the yellow light spilling from the saloon windows. Sheriff Morgan led the prisoners directly to the jail, while Deputy Johnson escorted the Summers to the hotel. "You should both get some rest," the deputy advised. "The sheriff will want statements in the morning, and the circuit judge won't be through for another 2 weeks. You'll need to stay in town until then to testify." Ryker, who had dismounted and was tying his horse to the hotel hitching post, paused at this information. 2 weeks. Standard procedure for serious crimes like kidnapping, Johnson explained. Judge Wilson handles 3 counties, won't be back this way until the 15th. Professor Summers nodded wearily, of course. "We'll make arrangements to stay." Violet glanced at Ryker, noting the slight frown that crossed his face at the news. Was he concerned about them remaining in town or about the delay to his own plans? "Mr. Newell," she said, approaching him as her father and the deputy went inside to secure rooms. "I realize we've imposed on your generosity far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect. Please don't feel obligated to." "I have business in town tomorrow anyway," he interrupted, his tone gruff yet somehow gentle. "Need to speak with the bank about a loan extension." Violet studied him in the dim light from the hotel windows, trying to read the expression in his eyes. "And after that?" Ryker shifted, his gaze moving to the darkened street beyond. "I still need to get to Helena. Cattle prices won't wait for kidnappings and court proceedings." "Of course," Violet tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Well, I hope you know how truly grateful we are for everything you've done. Father and I owe you a debt we can never adequately repay." Something flickered in Ryker's expression, a momentary softening that he quickly masked. "There's no debt, Miss Summers. You would have managed fine without me. You proved that today." Before she could respond, Professor Summers emerged from the hotel, looking exhausted but relieved. "They've given us 2 rooms for as long as we need them. Violet, my dear, you should rest. It's been an ordeal for you as well." "In a moment, Father," she turned back to Ryker. "Will you come for breakfast tomorrow? The hotel dining room at 8. It would give Father a proper chance to thank you." Ryker hesitated, then nodded once. 8 o'clock. With that, he untied his horse and mounted in one fluid motion. "Good night, Miss Summers, Professor." As he rode away into the darkness, Violet felt her father's gentle hand on her shoulder. "An interesting man, your Mr. Newell." "He's not my Mr. Newell," she corrected automatically, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Her father's knowing smile told her he wasn't convinced. "Come, my dear, we both need rest. Tomorrow will bring its own concerns." As they climbed the stairs to their rooms, Violet found her thoughts returning to Ryker, to his reluctant kindness, his surprising gentleness beneath the gruff exterior, and the shadows she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. For a man so determined to keep the world at a distance, he had risked everything to help 2 strangers. The question that followed her into sleep was why a man capable of such actions would choose to live alone, far from the connections that most people considered essential to a meaningful life. Morning brought clarity and warmth to Whitewater Springs, the early summer sun burning away both the night chill and the immediate fear of the previous day's events. Violet woke feeling surprisingly refreshed, despite the lingering soreness from her adventure through the mine shaft. After dressing in the one remaining clean outfit from her salvaged belongings, a pale green day dress that her father had always said matched her eyes, she checked on him in the adjoining room. Professor Summers was already awake, dressed, and seated by the window with one of his rescued notebooks. You should be resting, she admonished gently, noting the bruise on his cheek where Harmon had struck him. My mind rests better when engaged, my dear. He smiled, the familiar expression a balm to her heart after the fear of losing him. Besides, I need to assess what damage those brigands might have done to my research. Is anything missing? Nothing significant. They were clearly interested in the survey coordinates, but they lacked the knowledge to interpret them correctly. He closed the notebook with a sigh. Though I fear this incident may cause the university board to reconsider funding the remainder of our expedition. Violet sat across from him, concern creasing her brow. Would that be so terrible? We could return to Philadelphia, resume our life there. Her father studied her thoughtfully. Is that what you want, Violet, to return east? The question caught her off guard. She had followed her father west out of duty and love, expecting to eventually return to the familiar comforts of Philadelphia society. Yet now, having experienced the raw beauty and challenge of the Montana Territory, and having met people like Ryker Newell, whose quiet strength seemed born of this untamed land, the thought of returning east felt strangely like retreat. I'm not sure, she admitted honestly. I came west for you, but I find myself drawn to the possibilities here. Professor Summers smiled knowingly, and perhaps to certain individuals as well. Violet felt heat rise to her cheeks. Father, really, I've known Mr. Newell for all of 2 days. And yet in those 2 days he has saved your life, helped rescue me, and unless I'm greatly mistaken, made quite an impression on my usually level-headed daughter. Before Violet could formulate a suitably dignified response, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Sheriff Morgan, come to take their formal statements about the kidnapping. The interruption was both welcome and frustrating, as it postponed any further discussion of Ryker Newell and Violet's confusing feelings toward him. By the time they finished with the sheriff's questions, it was nearly 8 o'clock. Violet found herself growing inexplicably nervous as they made their way downstairs to the hotel dining room. Would Ryker actually come as promised, or would he have already departed for Helena, leaving their brief connection to fade like morning mist under the summer sun? The dining room was busy with hotel guests and locals who came for the hotel's renowned biscuits and gravy. Violet scanned the room as they entered, her heart sinking when she didn't immediately spot Ryker's tall figure among the diners. Perhaps he was delayed, her father suggested kindly, noting her expression as they were seated at a table near the window. Or perhaps he's already left for Helena, Violet replied, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. He mentioned needing to sell cattle. Good morning. The deep voice behind her caused Violet to turn so quickly she nearly upset her water glass. Ryker stood there, looking surprisingly well-groomed in a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair still damp from what must have been a recent washing. Without his customary hat, he appeared younger, less guarded. Mr. Newell, Professor Summers rose to shake his hand warmly. Please join us. As Ryker took the seat across from Violet, she noticed something different about him. A hesitancy that hadn't been present during their shared danger of the previous day, as if this social interaction was somehow more threatening than facing armed outlaws. Did you manage to speak with the bank? She asked, hoping to ease his obvious discomfort. He nodded, his fingers drumming briefly on the tablecloth before he stilled them. They've agreed to extend my loan for another month, given the circumstances. Excellent, Professor Summers beamed. I'm glad to hear it, and I understand we have you to thank for our comfortable accommodations as well. The hotel manager mentioned you arranged for our rooms last night. Violet looked up in surprise. Ryker hadn't mentioned this arrangement. It seemed the least I could do, Ryker said, shifting slightly under her gaze. The hotel owner owed me a favor from when I helped with repairs after last spring's flooding. Well, I insist on settling the account before we leave, the professor said firmly. Which brings me to a more important matter, my profound gratitude for your assistance to my daughter and myself. Your actions were nothing short of heroic. Anyone would have done the same, Ryker demurred, the familiar phrase causing Violet to smile despite herself. We both know that's not true, she said quietly. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, a shared understanding of the choices he had made that contradicted his professed desire for isolation. The arrival of breakfast temporarily redirected the conversation to more mundane matters. The quality of the food, the weather, the latest news from Helena that the professor had read in the hotel's day-old newspaper. Throughout the meal, Violet found herself watching Ryker, noticing how he gradually relaxed as her father engaged him in discussion about ranching conditions and local geography. It was only when the meal was concluding that Professor Summers broached the subject Violet had been both anticipating and dreading. So, Mr. Newell, when do you depart for Helena? Riker set down his coffee cup carefully. Not today, as it happens. There are some matters at the ranch that need attention before I can leave. His eyes flickered briefly to Violet. The journey can wait a few more days. Splendid, the professor exclaimed. Then perhaps you might be persuaded to join us for dinner this evening. I understand the hotel serves an excellent venison stew on Thursdays. Father, Violet interjected gently, Mr. Newell may have other plans. We shouldn't impose further on his time. It's no imposition, Riker said, surprising them both. I'd be glad to join you, 7 o'clock. As they agreed on the time and rose to part ways, Violet found herself wondering at the change in Riker's demeanor. The man who had so firmly stated his intention to leave now seemed in no hurry to do so. Outside the hotel, as her father excused himself to visit the general store for some much-needed supplies, Violet found herself momentarily alone with Riker on the boardwalk. You didn't mention that you'd arranged for our rooms, she said, unable to keep a hint of accusation from her voice. Riker shrugged, his eyes on the street rather than on her. It didn't seem important. It was thoughtful. It was practical. You both needed rest after what happened. Violet studied his profile, the stubborn set of his jaw that seemed at odds with the considerations he continually showed. Why is it so difficult for you to accept gratitude, Mr. Newell? Now he did look at her, something vulnerable flickering briefly in his expression before it was masked by his usual reserve. Because gratitude implies debt, and debt creates obligations. I don't want your obligation, Miss Summers. The blunt honesty of his response caught her off guard. What do you want, then? For a moment, Riker seemed as startled by the question as she was by asking it. He looked away, his gaze moving toward the distant mountains visible beyond the town's rooftops. I'm not entirely sure anymore, he admitted finally, his voice so low she had to lean slightly forward to hear him. I thought I knew. Before you arrived. The implication in his words sent a warmth spreading through Violet's chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Before she could respond, however, he straightened and took a step back, the moment of openness passing. I should see to my horse and get back to the ranch. There are chores waiting. Of course, Violet nodded, recognizing his retreat but feeling strangely untroubled by it. He might be stepping back physically, but his words and his agreement to dinner suggested he wasn't withdrawing completely. Until this evening, then. As he touched the brim of his hat and turned to go, Violet called after him impulsively. Mr. Newell. He paused, looking back at her with a raised eyebrow. Thank you, not for the rooms or the rescue or any specific thing, just thank you. Something softened in his expression, a warmth that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. You're welcome, Miss Summers. As he walked away toward the livery, Violet found herself smiling. The man who had planned to leave immediately was now extending his stay, seemingly without regret. It might be a small victory, but it felt significant nonetheless. Her father rejoined her a few minutes later, packages in hand and a knowing twinkle in his eye as he observed her expression. I see Mr. Newell has departed. Temporarily, I trust. He'll join us for dinner, Violet confirmed, trying and failing to sound casual about the arrangement. Excellent. Professor Summers offered her his arm as they began walking back toward the hotel. You know, my dear, I've always believed that the most interesting geological formations are those created by opposing forces, pressure from one direction met by resistance from another. The result is often unexpected but invariably fascinating. Violet gave him a sidelong glance. Are you comparing Mr. Newell and myself to rock formations, father? He chuckled, merely observing that when a force of nature meets an immovable object, something has to give. And our Mr. Newell, for all his determination to remain solitary, seems to be discovering that some forces cannot be resisted indefinitely. You're being ridiculous, Violet protested, though her heart beat a little faster at the suggestion. Mr. Newell has been kind to us, nothing more. If you say so, my dear, her father's smile remained firmly in place. If you say so. The days that followed established a pattern that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. Ryker, who had lived in self-imposed isolation for years, found himself riding into town each day, ostensibly to check on his banking arrangements or to purchase supplies, but inevitably ending up spending hours with Violet and her father. Professor Summers, still recovering from his ordeal, had taken to holding impromptu lectures on the hotel's front porch, where locals gathered to hear about geological formations and mining prospects. Riker often found himself lingering at these sessions, impressed by the professor's knowledge and engaging manner, but more captivated by the way Violet assisted her father, anticipating his needs and occasionally adding her own insights to the discussions. On the fourth day after the rescue, Riker arrived in town to find the professor alone on the porch, surrounded by his usual audience of miners, shopkeepers, and curious travelers. "Ah, Mr. Newell," the older man called out cheerfully. "Just in time, we were discussing the remarkable fossil discoveries in the territory." Riker tipped his hat in greeting but found his eyes scanning the gathered crowd. "Is Miss Summers not joining you today?" Something knowing flickered in the professor's eyes. "Violet mentioned something about needing fresh air and exercise. I believe she walked toward the creek at the edge of town." Without conscious decision, Riker found himself thanking the professor and turning his horse in the direction of Whitewater Creek, a pleasant stream that meandered along the western edge of town. It didn't occur to him until he was already halfway there that his eagerness to find Violet might appear obvious to others, particularly her perceptive father. He found her sitting on a fallen log by the water, sketchbook in hand, so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear his approach until he was only a few yards away. When she looked up, the smile that brightened her face sent an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. "Mr. Newell," she greeted him, closing her sketchbook. "I didn't expect to see you today." "Your father said you'd gone for a walk." Riker dismounted, tethering his horse to a nearby sapling. "Thought I'd make sure you hadn't found more trouble to get into." She laughed, the sound as clear and refreshing as the creek beside them. "I believe I've met my quota of trouble for at least a month." "I was simply sketching the landscape." She hesitated, then offered him the book. "Would you like to see?" Riker sat beside her on the log, careful to maintain a respectable distance as he accepted the sketchbook. Opening it, he found himself looking at a remarkably skilled rendering of the creek and the rolling hills beyond, with the distant mountains rising majestically in the background. "You have talent," he said, genuinely impressed. "It looks exactly like the view from here." "Thank you." Violet seemed pleased by his approval. "Father always encouraged my drawing. He says it trains the eye to observe details others might miss, a useful skill for both artists and scientists." Riker turned the page, finding more sketches. The main street of Whitewater Springs, a flock of birds rising from a meadow, and to his surprise, a portrait of himself. It was a quick study, evidently drawn during one of the professor's lectures, capturing him in profile as he listened intently. He stared at it, strangely moved by how she had seen him, not as the hard, isolated figure he had thought himself to be, but as something altogether more thoughtful and engaged. "I hope you don't mind," Violet said softly, noting his prolonged examination of the sketch. "You have an interesting face, strong lines." Riker closed the book carefully, returning it to her. "No one's ever drawn me before. Consider it a small repayment for all you've done for us." She tucked the sketchbook into her satchel, her expression turning more serious, "though in truth, nothing could adequately repay your kindness." "I told you before, there's no debt." Riker found himself looking at the creek rather than at her, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "No debt," she agreed. "But perhaps a connection." The simple question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had openly acknowledged during their daily interactions in town. Riker felt a familiar tension rising in his chest, the instinct to retreat, to guard himself against the vulnerability her words invited. Yet something had changed in the past week. The careful walls he had built around himself no longer seemed as solid or as necessary as they once had. "I'm not good at connections," he said finally, still watching the play of sunlight on water. "Haven't had much practice." "Because you prefer it that way, or because you've convinced yourself you do?" Now he did look at her, surprised by her directness. Violet's expression was open, genuinely curious rather than challenging. "After the war," he began, then paused, the words unfamiliar in his mouth after years of keeping his past to himself. "After the war, I came west because there was nothing left for me in Virginia. My family's farm was burned, my parents gone, my brother killed at Chancellorsville." Violet's hand moved as if to touch his, then withdrew, respecting his space. "I'm so sorry." "It wasn't just the losses," Riker continued, finding that now he'd started, the words seemed determined to come. It was what the war showed about people, how quickly civilization falls away when things get desperate. I saw men I'd known all my life turn on each other over a crust of bread or a pair of boots.
So you came west to escape. To start fresh.
To build something that was mine alone, that couldn't be taken by someone else's war or someone else's choices. He picked up a small stone, turning it over in his fingers.
Figured the safest way to live was to need no one. And has it worked? Her voice was gentle. Has isolation made you feel safe?
Ryker tossed the stone into the creek, watching the ripples spread outward. It did, until a few days ago. Violet was silent, waiting for him to continue, her patience more compelling than any direct question could have been. A week ago I would have told you that I had everything figured out, he admitted. That I knew exactly what I wanted from life, my land, my cattle, and enough success to be beholden to no one. Simple.
Straightforward. And now,
he turned to face her fully, struck again by the clarity in her green eyes, the intelligence and empathy that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed defenses. Now I'm sitting by a creek with a woman I met less than a week ago, telling her things I haven't told another living soul in years. He shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. If that's not evidence of my carefully ordered life falling apart, I don't know what is. To his surprise, Violet laughed, not mockingly, but with a warmth that invited him to share in the absurdity of the situation. Perhaps it's not falling apart, Mr. Newell. Perhaps it's finally coming together. Their eyes met and something shifted between them, a recognition that the connection they'd been circling for days was real and mutual. For a moment, Ryker felt an overwhelming urge to close the distance between them, to discover if her lips were as soft as they looked. Instead, he stood, needing physical movement to counter the emotional tide threatening to sweep away the last of his reservations. We should head back. Your father will be wondering where you are. Violet rose as well, gathering her satchel. You're changing the subject, Mr. Newell.
Ryker, he said impulsively, if we're going to have connections, you might as well use my given name.
Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Ryker, she repeated, the name sounding different better in her voice, and I'm Violet, not Miss Summers. Violet, he acknowledged, the simple exchange of names feeling strangely significant, like a pact being sealed. As they walked back toward town, their horses trailing behind them, Ryker found himself thinking about the ranch waiting for him beyond the town limits, the solitary cabin that had once represented everything he thought he wanted. For the first time since settling there, he tried to imagine it differently, with books on the shelves, sketches on the walls, and the sound of Violet's laughter filling spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. The image should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like a possibility he was increasingly unwilling to dismiss. The following days brought a deepening of their connection that neither Ryker nor Violet openly acknowledged, but both increasingly relied upon. Their daily meetings, initially coincidental, became deliberate, with Ryker timing his visits to town around the professor's lectures or Violet's sketching expeditions. They spoke of small things and large. Her childhood in Philadelphia, his experiences homesteading in the territory, their shared love of literature discovered during an impromptu discussion of Walden that had lasted well into the evening. Each conversation seemed to build a bridge across the chasm of their different backgrounds, revealing commonalities neither had expected to find. A week after the rescue, Sheriff Morgan brought news that Judge Wilson would arrive earlier than expected, perhaps within days. The announcement, delivered while Ryker, Violet, and her father were sharing dinner at the hotel, cast an unexpected shadow over their meal. That's excellent news, Professor Summers said, not noticing the sudden tension between the younger pair. The sooner we can give our testimony, the sooner those men will face justice for their crimes. And the sooner you'll be free to continue your journey, Ryker added quietly, his eyes on his plate rather than on Violet. Actually, the professor said, setting down his fork, I've been meaning to discuss our plans with you both. I've received a telegram from the university. They're concerned about the safety of continuing our expedition after what happened, but they're very interested in the preliminary findings from this area. Violet looked up, her brow furrowed. What does that mean for us, Father? It means, my dear, that they've authorized me to establish a more permanent base of operations here in Whitewater Springs. I'm to conduct my surveys from a fixed location rather than traveling extensively. Ryker's head jerked up, surprise evident in his expression. You're staying in Whitewater Springs? For the foreseeable future, yes. The professor's eyes twinkled knowingly as he glanced between them, unless, of course, Violet has objections to remaining in the area. Violet's cheeks flushed slightly. I think it's an excellent plan, she said carefully, not quite meeting Riker's gaze. The town seems very welcoming, and there's certainly no shortage of geological wonders to study nearby. Indeed, her father agreed, barely concealing his satisfaction. The only question is suitable accommodations. The hotel is comfortable but hardly appropriate for extended residence. Peterson at the general store has a house for rent on the edge of town, Riker found himself saying. 2 bedrooms, decent-sized kitchen. It's been vacant since the previous tenant moved to Oregon last spring. The professor raised an eyebrow. You seem remarkably well informed about the rental properties in town for a man who lives alone on a ranch miles away. Riker shifted uncomfortably, aware that he'd revealed more than he intended. The truth was he'd been discreetly inquiring about available housing in town for the past 3 days, ever since he'd realized the depth of his reluctance to see Violet leave. I hear things, he said vaguely. People talk. Indeed they do, the professor agreed, his smile suggesting he knew exactly what kind of inquiries Riker had been making. Well, I shall speak with Mr. Peterson tomorrow. Perhaps, Riker, you might accompany Violet to view the property while I meet with Sheriff Morgan about our testimony. A young woman's perspective on a potential home is invaluable, but a man with practical knowledge of local construction would be an additional benefit. The transparent manipulation was so obvious that Riker nearly laughed out loud. Instead, he nodded gravely, I'd be happy to assist. Later that evening, as Riker escorted the Summers back to the hotel after dinner, he found himself walking slightly behind with Violet while her father forged ahead, ostensibly distracted by a geological formation in a building's foundation. Your father isn't particularly subtle, Riker observed quietly. Violet's soft laugh was his reward. He believes life is too short for subtlety, a sentiment he's expressed more frequently since my mother's passing. Is he right? About life being too short? She glanced up at him, her expression thoughtful in the light from the hotel windows. I believe so. We never know how much time we have, so spending it on artifice seems wasteful. They had reached the hotel steps, where Professor Summers was making a show of examining the stone railing, though his occasional glances in their direction revealed his true interest. In that spirit of honesty, Riker said, lowering his voice further, I should tell you that I've been hoping you might stay in Whitewater Springs. I've gotten used to seeing you every day. The thought of returning to how things were before you arrived, he paused, searching for the right words. Let's just say the prospect holds considerably less appeal than it once did. The smile that illuminated Violet's face was worth every moment of vulnerability the admission had cost him. I've been hoping the same thing, she confessed. The idea of continuing westward without the connections I've made here, it didn't feel right. For a moment they stood in silence, the admission of mutual failing creating a warmth between them that defied the evening chill. Tomorrow then, Riker said finally, 10 o'clock to see Peterson's house. Tomorrow, she agreed, her eyes holding his a moment longer than strictly proper. Good night, Riker. As he watched her join her father and enter the hotel, Riker found himself standing on the boardwalk long after they'd disappeared from view, marveling at how completely his carefully ordered existence had been transformed in the span of a week. The ranch that had once been his refuge now seemed empty when he returned each evening. The solitude he had cultivated for years now felt less like freedom and more like absence, specifically, the absence of Violet's laugh, her insightful observations, and the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of things that mattered to her. Tomorrow, he decided as he finally turned toward the livery to retrieve his horse, he would stop pretending this was a temporary disruption to his life. Tomorrow, he would begin figuring out what came next. The house that Peterson was offering for rent exceeded both Riker and Violet's expectations. Located at the edge of town with a clear view of the surrounding hills, it was a sturdy 2-story structure with ample space for both living and working. The previous tenant, a widowed doctor who had moved west for his health, had left much of the furniture behind, making it almost immediately habitable. The upstairs would make an excellent study for father, Violet observed as they toured the rooms. And look at the light in this front room, perfect for sketching on rainy days. Riker watched her move through the space, noting how she immediately saw possibilities where others might have seen only an empty house. She touched door frames, peered out windows, and tested floorboards with a practical eye that belied her refined appearance. What do you think? She asked, turning to find him observing her. I think you've already decided, he replied with a smile. I can see you arranging furniture and hanging curtains in your mind. She laughed, the sound echoing pleasantly in the empty room. Is it that obvious? I do think it would suit us perfectly. Close enough to town for Father's lectures, but private enough for his work and mine. You're sketching. Among other things, Violet ran her hand along a windowsill, her expression thoughtful. Father has encouraged me to write about our experiences in the West. He believes there would be interest back east in a woman's perspective on territorial life. He's probably right, Ryker agreed, moving to stand beside her at the window. You have a way of seeing things, both the beauty and the reality, that others miss. She glanced up at him, something warm in her gaze. Thank you, that means a great deal, especially coming from someone who understands this land so well. Outside the window, Whitewater Springs spread before them, the main street bustling with the usual morning activity. Wagons delivering goods, townspeople moving between businesses, children darting through the dusty street in some elaborate game. Beyond the town, the rolling prairie stretched toward distant mountains, the landscape both harsh and beautiful in the clear morning light. It's a good view, Ryker said softly. Yes, Violet agreed, though when he looked down, he found her watching him rather than the scene outside. It is. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had been building for days reaching a point that demanded acknowledgement. Ryker found himself leaning slightly closer, drawn by a force that seemed as natural and inevitable as gravity. Violet, he began, his voice lower than he intended. The front door banged open downstairs, followed by Professor Summers' enthusiastic voice calling up to them. Violet, Ryker, where are you? I've spoken with Peterson, and the terms are quite reasonable. The moment broke, reality reasserting itself as they stepped apart. Violet's cheeks were flushed, though whether from embarrassment or something else, Ryker couldn't tell. Upstairs, Father, she called back, her voice remarkably steady. We're just finishing our tour. As footsteps sounded on the stairs, Ryker moved toward the door, creating a more appropriate distance between them. By the time Professor Summers appeared in the doorway, beaming with satisfaction, they had adopted the casual poses of two people merely inspecting a property. Isn't it perfect? The professor exclaimed, gesturing expansively. Peterson says we can move in as early as tomorrow. He's even arranged for help with our luggage. That's wonderful news, Violet said, her composure fully restored though her eyes still held a hint of the moment that had passed between them. I was just telling Ryker how well the house would suit our needs. Indeed, her father moved to examine the view from the window, and such a location. I can already envision setting up my equipment on that flat area behind the house for observations. As the professor continued his enthusiastic assessment of the property, Ryker found his attention divided between the practical considerations being discussed and the woman who now moved about the room with her father, pointing out features and suggesting arrangements. The domesticity of the scene stirred something deep within him, a longing he had denied for so long that its sudden resurgence left him both exhilarated and terrified. When they finally left the house, the professor walked ahead, already making notes about furniture requirements and equipment placement. Ryker and Violet followed a few paces behind, close enough for propriety but with enough privacy for quiet conversation. Your father seems pleased with the arrangement, Ryker observed. He is. Violet's smile was affectionate as she watched her father's animated gestures. Though I suspect his enthusiasm has as much to do with the company we've found here as with the geological opportunities. Ryker raised an eyebrow. The company? You, she said simply. He admires you, you know. Says you remind him of the best students he had at the university, those who learned from observation rather than just books. The compliment warmed him unexpectedly. Your father is a remarkable man. His acceptance in Whitewater Springs speaks to that. Most Eastern academics wouldn't be embraced so quickly in a frontier town. Most Eastern academics wouldn't take the time to explain complex geological concepts to miners and ranchers in terms they can understand and apply, Violet pointed out. Father believes knowledge belongs to everyone, not just those with formal education. A democratic view of learning, Ryker nodded. It suits him and you share it, I think. I try to, she glanced up at him, a hint of mischief in her expression. Though I confess, some subjects require more personal instruction than others. Before Ryker could respond to this intriguing statement, they had reached the main street, where the professor was already engaged in conversation with Sheriff Morgan outside the general store. Ah, there you are, Morgan called as they approached. I was just telling the professor, Judge Wilson arrived on the morning stage. He's setting up court at the town hall tomorrow morning.
8 o'clock sharp for your testimonies.
So soon, Violet looked startled. I thought we had at least another day or two.
Judge Wilson doesn't believe in wasting time, Morgan explained.
He wants to hear the Harmon case first thing, then move on to the other matters before he heads to Helena.
Well, the sooner it's concluded, the better, Professor Summers declared.
Then we can focus on settling into our new home without that business hanging over us. As the sheriff and professor discussed the details of the upcoming hearing, Ryker noticed the slight tension in Violet's posture. Are you worried about testifying? He asked quietly. No, she shook her head. It's just, afterward, everything seems to be moving so quickly. The house, the trial, our decision to stay in Whitewater Springs.
Do you regret it? Deciding to stay?
Her eyes met his clear and direct. Not for a moment, but I am uncertain about what comes next.
The vulnerability in her admission touched something in Ryker.
This remarkable woman who had faced armed kidnappers without flinching and crawled through an abandoned mine to rescue her father was admitting to uncertainty about the future, a future that he was increasingly certain involved him in some capacity.
I've been thinking about that, he said carefully, about what comes next.
The sheriff's voice interrupted before he could continue. Newell, you'll need to testify as well. You were part of the rescue party.
Ryker turned, acknowledging the sheriff with a nod. I'll be there.
Good. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to make sure the jail is secure before the judge's inspection. Morgan tipped his hat to Violet and strode off toward the sheriff's office. Violet, my dear, Professor Summers said, turning to them, I believe I'll examine Peterson's inventory while we're here. We'll need additional supplies for the house.
Of course, Father, she replied. Would you like me to help you select them?
The professor waved dismissively. No, I'm quite capable of identifying basic household necessities. Why don't you and Ryker continue your discussion?
You seemed deep in conversation when we arrived.
With that transparent excuse, he disappeared into the store, leaving them standing alone on the boardwalk. Your father is becoming less subtle by the day, Ryker observed dryly. Violet's laugh was soft but genuine.
He's never been patient when he sees something that needs to happen. And what does he see that needs to happen?
Their eyes met, and the directness in her gaze made his heart beat faster.
I think you know, Ryker.
The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Ryker was acutely aware that they were standing in the middle of Whitewater Springs' Main Street, visible to anyone who cared to look. Yet he couldn't bring himself to step away. You mentioned uncertainty about what comes next, he said finally. I've been feeling the same. For years I was certain about exactly what I wanted: solitude, independence, a life answerable to no one. And then you arrived, and suddenly everything I thought I knew about myself came into question.
Violet's expression softened. Is that a bad thing, having certainties challenged?
I'm beginning to think it might be the best thing that's ever happened to me. The words came more easily than he would have expected, as if saying them aloud simply acknowledged what he'd already accepted in his heart. I don't want to return to the way things were before you came to Whitewater Springs, Violet. The thought of going back to that solitary existence feels empty now. What are you saying, Ryker? Her voice was steady, but he could see the hope and wariness battling in her expression. I'm saying that I'd like to call on you properly once you're settled in your new home, with your father's permission, of course. He took a deep breath, surprised by how much the answer mattered to him.
Would that be welcome?
The smile that illuminated her face was all the answer he needed before she even spoke. It would be very welcome indeed. For a moment they stood there, the simple exchange opening a door to possibilities neither had anticipated a week earlier. Then, conscious of their public location and the proprieties that still governed even frontier towns, Ryker took a small step back. I should let you join your father, he said reluctantly, and I have ranch business to attend to before tomorrow's hearing. Of course, Violet's expression remained radiant despite the practical interruption. Until tomorrow, then. Tomorrow, he agreed, the word no longer carrying the finality it once had, no longer a signal of departure but a promise of continuation. As he watched her enter the store, Ryker found himself standing taller, as if a weight he hadn't fully recognized had been lifted from his shoulders. The man who had once believed that isolation was the only path to security now faced a future where connection, not solitude, offered the greater promise of fulfillment. Tomorrow would bring the trial, the formal end to the danger that had brought them together. But it would also mark the beginning of something neither had been looking for but both now recognized as essential. A shared path forward step by careful step, the town hall of Whitewater Springs had been transformed overnight into a makeshift courtroom. Benches from the church lined one side for spectators, while a table and chair for Judge Wilson dominated the front of the room. By the time Ryker arrived at 7:45 the following morning, the space was already filling with curious townspeople eager to witness the proceedings. He spotted Violet and her father seated near the front, both dressed formally for the occasion. Violet wore a dark blue dress that highlighted the auburn tones in her hair, which was arranged more elaborately than he had seen before. When she turned and caught sight of him, the smile that lit her face sent a warmth through his chest that had become familiar yet no less powerful in recent days. Ryker made his way to them, nodding greetings to the various townspeople who called out to him, a stark contrast to the minimal acknowledgments he would have received just weeks ago. "Good morning," he said, taking the seat Violet had saved beside her. "Are you both ready for this?" "As ready as one can be," Professor Summers replied, his usual cheerfulness tempered by the seriousness of the occasion. "Sheriff Morgan reviewed our testimonies with us again this morning. He says the case is straightforward, given the circumstances of our capture. The Harmons have apparently decided to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for reduced sentences," Violet added quietly. "The sheriff thinks the judge will accept the arrangement, especially since Father's research wasn't permanently compromised." Before Ryker could respond, the back door opened, and Sheriff Morgan entered with the Harmon brothers, all three handcuffed and looking considerably less menacing than they had at the mine. They were seated at a small table opposite the judge's position, guarded by both Morgan and Deputy Johnson. The leader, the scarred man who had threatened Professor Summers, glanced around the room until his gaze fell on Violet. His expression darkened briefly before Morgan muttered something that made him turn away. Ryker felt Violet tense beside him, and without thinking, placed his hand over hers where it rested on the bench between them. "It's almost over," he said softly. "They can't hurt you or your father now." She turned her hand to briefly squeeze his in gratitude before propriety required they separate as more townspeople filed in, filling the remaining seats. At precisely 8 o'clock, the side door opened and Judge Wilson entered. He was a tall, austere man with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room at a glance. The crowd rose respectfully as he took his seat. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice surprisingly gentle despite his stern appearance. "The Territorial Court for Montana is now in session. We will begin with the case of the Territory versus Edgar, Jebediah, and Clarence Harmon, charged with kidnapping, assault, robbery, and attempted claim jumping." What followed was a remarkably efficient proceeding. The judge heard brief statements from Sheriff Morgan outlining the charges, then from each of the victims, first Professor Summers, then Violet, and finally Ryker, whose testimony regarding the rescue was delivered with the same straightforward clarity that characterized everything he did. Throughout Violet's testimony, Ryker found himself filled with pride at her composure. She recounted the terrifying events of the attack and her subsequent escape without dramatization, but with enough detail to leave no doubt about the seriousness of the Harmons' crimes. When she described crawling through the ventilation shaft to reach her father, a murmur of admiration ran through the courtroom. Judge Wilson himself looked impressed, peering at the slight young woman over his spectacles as if reassessing her. "That was a remarkably brave action, Miss Summers," he commented when she concluded. "Many men would have hesitated to attempt such a rescue." "My father needed help, Your Honor," she replied simply. "I did what was necessary." The judge nodded, then turned his attention to the defendants. The Harmons, faced with overwhelming evidence and witnesses, confirmed their desire to plead guilty to reduced charges. After a brief consultation with the sheriff, Judge Wilson accepted the arrangement. "Edgar Harmon, Jebediah Harmon, and Clarence Harmon, this court sentences you each to 5 years in the territorial prison for the crimes to which you have admitted," the judge pronounced. "Had you proceeded to trial on all charges, you would likely have faced considerably longer terms. Consider yourselves fortunate." With a sharp rap of his gavel, the judge concluded the case. "Sheriff, see that the prisoners are prepared for transport to Helena on tomorrow's stage. The court will recess for 30 minutes before hearing the Miller property dispute." As the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to congratulate Professor Summers and Violet on the outcome, Ryker felt a curious mixture of relief and anticipation. The danger that had brought them together was now officially behind them, the men who had threatened Violet and her father facing justice. Yet the real challenge, figuring out what came next for his relationship with Violet, was only beginning. A satisfactory conclusion, wouldn't you say? Professor Summers commented as they made their way outside into the bright morning sunlight. 5 years should give those men ample time to reconsider their life choices. Indeed, Violet agreed, though Ryker noted she still glanced back at the town hall where the Harmons were being returned to the jail. I'm just glad it's over. As am I, her father said, patting her hand affectionately. Now we can focus on more pleasant matters, like settling into our new home. Peterson assures me the furniture will be delivered this afternoon. Ryker, who had been quietly walking beside them, cleared his throat. If you need help with anything, moving furniture, repairs, I'd be happy to assist. The professor beamed at him. Most generous of you, my boy. In fact, I was hoping you might be available this afternoon for exactly that purpose. There's a particularly heavy bookcase that will require a strong back to position correctly. Father, Violet interjected, a hint of embarrassment in her tone. Ryker undoubtedly has his own responsibilities at the ranch. We can't expect him to drop everything to help us move furniture. It's no trouble, Ryker assured her, meeting her eyes with a warmth that belied his casual tone. The ranch can manage without me for an afternoon. Well, that's settled then, the professor declared with obvious satisfaction. Shall we say 2 o'clock? That should give Peterson's men time to deliver the larger pieces. With arrangements made, they parted temporarily, the Summers to finalize details with Peterson, and Ryker to attend to some banking business before returning to help with the move. As he watched them walk away, Violet glancing back once with a smile that seemed meant for him alone, Ryker felt a certainty settling over him that had nothing to do with the day's scheduled activities and everything to do with his longer-term intentions. By the time he returned to the Summers' new home that afternoon, the major furniture pieces had indeed been delivered, creating a maze of chairs, tables, and cabinets throughout the downstairs rooms. Violet, her hair now tied back simply and her formal dress exchanged for a more practical one, was directing 2 delivery men who were maneuvering a dining table into position. Ah, Ryker, Professor Summers called from the top of the stairs. Perfect timing. Would you mind helping me with this bookcase? These gentlemen placed it against the wrong wall entirely. For the next several hours, Ryker found himself immersed in the domestic chaos of establishing a home. He moved furniture, hung pictures, assembled a bed frame, and even repaired a loose railing on the back steps, all under the enthusiastic direction of Professor Summers and the more practical guidance of Violet. What struck him most, however, was not the physical labor but the easy camaraderie that developed among the 3 of them. The professor's academic digressions, Violet's gentle teasing of both men, and the shared satisfaction of seeing empty rooms gradually transform into a home created an atmosphere of warmth unlike anything Ryker had experienced since before the war. By early evening, the major work was complete. The delivery men had long since departed, and the 3 of them stood in the now functional kitchen, surveying their accomplishments with well-earned pride. I believe this calls for a celebration, Professor Summers announced, producing a bottle of wine from a crate of kitchen supplies. Our first meal in our new home, simple though it may be, and a toast to new beginnings. As Violet prepared a modest meal from the provisions they had purchased that morning, Ryker found himself setting the table, a domestic task he hadn't performed for anyone but himself in years. The normalcy of it, the sense of participating in something ordinary yet profound, struck him with unexpected force. When they finally sat down to eat, the professor raised his glass. To Whitewater Springs, our new home. And to you, Ryker, without whom we might never have found it, or indeed survived to enjoy it. To new beginnings, Violet added, her eyes meeting Ryker's across the table with a warmth that made the simple meal feel like a feast. Later, as twilight settled over the town, Professor Summers excused himself to organize his study, leaving Ryker and Violet alone on the small front porch. They sat side by side on a bench that Ryker had carried in from the wagon earlier, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Thank you, Violet said after a comfortable silence. Not just for today, but for everything since we met. I'm not sure I've properly expressed how much your help has meant to us. You don't need to thank me, Ryker replied, his eyes on the distant mountains now silhouetted against the evening sky. Being here today, being included in creating your home, that's more than enough. She turned slightly to study his profile. Is it enough, I mean? The question hung between them, weighted with meanings that went beyond the day's activities. Riker felt the moment's significance, recognizing it as a threshold he could choose to cross or retreat from. No, he admitted finally, turning to meet her gaze directly. It's not enough, not anymore. Violet's expression softened with understanding. What would be enough, Riker? He took a breath, finding that the words came more easily than he had expected. Being part of your life, not just for an afternoon of moving furniture or a dinner to celebrate a new home, but regularly, permanently even. Are you asking to court me, Mr. Newell? A smile played at the corners of her mouth, though her eyes remained serious. I believe I am, Miss Summers. He matched her formal tone, though his heart was racing beneath the calm exterior. With your father's permission, of course. Which you already have, came the professor's voice from the doorway behind them, though I appreciate the adherence to propriety. Riker turned, startled to find Professor Summers standing there, a book in one hand and an unmistakable look of approval on his face. Sir, the professor waved away his surprise. My dear boy, did you think I wasn't aware of what has been developing between you and my daughter? I may be absorbed in geology, but I'm not blind to human nature. Violet laughed softly. Father has a rather direct approach to matters of the heart, as you may have noticed. Life is too short for unnecessary complications, the professor stated firmly. I have observed you both carefully. You, Riker, are a man of integrity, courage, and deeper feeling than you perhaps wish to acknowledge. My daughter is a woman of intelligence, compassion, and remarkable resilience. That you have found something valuable in each other seems both natural and fortunate. He stepped fully onto the porch, his expression becoming more serious. I have only one question for you, Riker. What are your intentions regarding my daughter? Despite having just broached the subject of courtship, Riker found himself momentarily at a loss for words. The directness of the question demanded an equally direct response, yet the feelings that had been growing within him seemed too profound for casual expression. My intentions, he began carefully, aware of Violet's eyes on him, are to court your daughter properly with respect and honor. And if she finds me worthy in time, he paused, then continued with quiet certainty, in time to offer her a life shared, a partnership based on mutual respect and affection. Something in the professor's expression softened. A partnership, not ownership or protection, but partnership. Good, very good, he nodded approvingly. You have my blessing to court Violet, though I suspect her opinion on the matter carries more weight than mine. With that, he turned back toward the door. I find I'm rather tired after today's exertions. I think I'll retire early and leave you young people to discuss these matters more privately. Good night. As the door closed behind him, Violet shook her head fondly. He's never been one for subtlety. A family trait, perhaps, Riker suggested, thinking of her own directness in the abandoned mine and by the creek. Perhaps, she smiled, then grew more serious. Did you mean what you said? About partnership. Riker nodded, finding it easier to be honest in the growing darkness. I've spent years believing that independence was the only way to protect myself from loss. That keeping people at a distance was somehow safer. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. But meeting you, seeing how you face challenges with courage and grace, how you connect with people without fear, it's made me question everything I thought I knew. He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and took her hand in his. I don't want safety if it means solitude anymore, Violet. I want a life with meaning, with purpose, with connection, with you if you'll have me. In the dim light from the windows, he could see her eyes shining with emotion. I think I've been waiting for you to say that since the day we met, she admitted softly, even when you were telling me you planned to leave the very next day. The best laid plans, Riker murmured, a smile tugging at his lips. I meant it, you know. That first morning I fully intended to ride to town, hand you over to the sheriff, and continue on my solitary way. What changed your mind? You did, he said simply. The look in your eyes when you spoke of your father, the determination, the loyalty, the refusal to stand aside while others took action. It reminded me of who I used to be, before I convinced myself that caring only led to pain. Violet's hand tightened around his. And now I'm beginning to remember that while caring carries risks, the alternative is far worse. Riker's voice dropped lower, intimate in the gathering darkness. Being with you, seeing the world through your eyes, makes everything clearer, more vivid. I don't want to go back to seeing in shadows. The honesty of his admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than any formal declaration could have been. Violet's response was equally direct. Then don't, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Stay in the light, Ryker, with me. The simplicity of her invitation, and the profound change it represented in his life's direction, left him momentarily speechless. Instead of words, he found himself leaning forward, drawn by a certainty that transcended the caution that had guided him for years. Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more profound. In that moment, with Violet's hand in his and her lips against his own, Riker felt the last of his carefully constructed barriers dissolving. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Riker rested his forehead against hers. I think I'm falling in love with you, Violet Summers, he admitted quietly. And it terrifies me almost as much as it exhilarates me. She smiled, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. Then we're perfectly matched because I feel exactly the same way. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, their conversation turning to plans and possibilities, Riker marveled at how completely his life had changed in less than 2 weeks. The man who had once defined himself by his isolation now found himself eagerly anticipating a future shaped by connection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Practical arrangements to be made, distances between ranch and town to be negotiated, a courtship to be conducted with appropriate respect for convention. But for now, sitting beside Violet on the porch of her new home, Riker allowed himself to simply embrace the moment, and the woman who had taught him that true strength lay not in isolation but in the courage to love despite the risks. The weeks that followed established a new pattern in Riker's life. While he still tended to his ranch during the days, he now rode into town most evenings to spend time with Violet and her father. Their courtship, conducted with proper decorum but genuine affection, quickly became the subject of approving gossip throughout Whitewater Springs. Professor Summers, far from playing the role of stern guardian, actively encouraged their relationship, often finding transparent excuses to leave them alone together during Riker's visits. His obvious approval eased any potential awkwardness, allowing their connection to deepen naturally. 1 month after the Harmons' trial, Riker arrived at the Summers' home to find Violet alone on the front porch, a letter in her hand and an expression of mixed emotions on her face. What's wrong? He asked immediately, recognizing the subtle signs of distress she rarely showed to others. Not wrong exactly, she replied, holding up the letter. It's from the university. They've offered Father a position leading an expanded geological survey throughout the Northern Territories. It would mean significant funding, a larger team of assistants, and considerable prestige. That's wonderful news, Riker said, though he noted her continued ambivalence. Isn't it? Violet sighed, folding the letter carefully. It would also mean traveling extensively for at least a year. Father would be based in Helena, with expeditions throughout Montana and into the Dakota Territory. Understanding dawned. And you would go with him? That's what he assumes, yes. She met his eyes directly. He's inside now making plans, already excited about the possibilities. Riker sat beside her, his mind working through the implications. After weeks of growing closer, of building something he had come to treasure beyond measure, the prospect of Violet leaving, even temporarily, created a hollow feeling in his chest. When would this start? 3 weeks from now. The autumn weather is apparently ideal for the initial surveys before winter sets in. Violet's fingers worried the edge of the letter. Father says we would return to Whitewater Springs periodically, between expeditions, but most of our time would be spent traveling. I see, Riker kept his voice neutral, though his thoughts were anything but calm. And what do you want, Violet? The directness of his question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked away, toward the distant mountains that had become familiar landmarks in her life. That's what I've been sitting here trying to determine, she admitted. A month ago I would have followed Father without question. His work has been my work, his journey mine as well, especially since Mother died. And now? She turned back to him, her eyes reflecting the inner conflict. Now I find myself thinking of this place as home, of the life I've begun to build here, of the connections I've made, her voice softened, of you, Riker. The simple acknowledgement warmed him, even as the situation challenged everything they had begun to build together. Your father would understand if you chose to stay, he said carefully. He values your happiness above all else. I know, she nodded, but I also know how much this opportunity means to him. After the kidnapping, I worried his career might have been compromised. This offer represents not just recognition, but vindication of his research. Riker considered this, understanding the complexity of her position, and if you stayed behind. He would manage, Violet said slowly. The university would provide assistance, but it wouldn't be the same for him. We've been a team since I was old enough to hold a rock hammer. They sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, the weight of the decision hovering between them. Then Riker took her hand, his mind suddenly clear. Come with me, he said, standing and gently pulling her to her feet. Where are we going? For a ride, there's something I want to show you. Curious despite her preoccupation, Violet allowed him to help her onto her horse, which was always kept ready in the small stable behind their house. Within minutes they were riding out of town, following the familiar trail toward Riker's ranch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling land, gilding the prairie grasses with amber light. They rode mostly in silence, Riker leading the way with purposeful direction while Violet followed, her expression thoughtful. When they reached his property, however, Riker surprised her by continuing past the turnoff to his cabin, instead guiding them toward a rise to the east that overlooked a picturesque valley. I've never been to this part of your land, Violet commented as they dismounted at the crest of the hill. Few people have, Riker replied, securing their horses before leading her to the edge of the overlook. This is what I wanted you to see. Below them, the valley spread out in a natural amphitheater, sheltered by low hills on three sides and open to the south where a small creek wound through meadowland. The setting sun illuminated the scene with dramatic clarity. A perfect building site nestled within easy distance of both his existing ranch buildings and the town. It's beautiful, Violet breathed, taking in the view. Why haven't you built here instead of where your cabin stands now? The current location made more sense for a single man focused solely on ranching, Riker explained. Closer to the main road, more practical for daily operations. He paused, his eyes on the valley rather than on her, but this spot would be perfect for a proper home for a family. The implication in his words hung in the air between them. Violet turned to study his profile, understanding slowly dawning in her expression. Riker, are you? He faced her fully now, his decision as clear as the vista before them. I had planned to wait a bit longer to court you properly for at least a few more months before speaking. But your father's opportunity changes things, and I find I don't want to waste any more time with uncertainty. Taking both her hands in his, Riker continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. I love you, Violet. I think I began falling in love with you that first day by the creek, when you stood in water up to your knees, pointing a pistol at me with more courage than fear in your eyes. Every day since then has only deepened that feeling. He gestured toward the valley below. I want to build a life with you, right here, a home large enough for your father to have his study and laboratory when he's not traveling. Land enough for both ranching and whatever other pursuits we might discover together. Violet's eyes had filled with tears, though her expression remained one of wonder rather than sadness. Are you asking me to marry you, Ryker Newell? I am, he confirmed, surprising himself with the calm certainty in his voice. I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner in everything, to build something here that neither of us could create alone. For a moment that seemed to stretch eternally, Violet simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if memorizing every detail. Then she stepped forward and placed her hand against his cheek, a gesture that had become familiar and precious in recent weeks. Yes, she said simply, her voice clear and certain. Yes, I will marry you. The joy that surged through Riker at her acceptance was unlike anything he had experienced before, a sensation of completeness, of rightness, that made every hardship he had endured seem worthwhile for having led him to this moment. He pulled her close, kissing her with a depth of feeling that transcended words. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Violet laughed, a sound of pure happiness that echoed across the valley that would become their home. My father will be ecstatic, she said, her arms still around his neck. He's been dropping increasingly unsubtle hints about how suitable you would be as a son-in-law. I know, Riker smiled. He approached me last week to discuss the matter quite directly, said he didn't want his new position to complicate what he called the obvious conclusion to your courtship. Violet's eyes widened. He already knew about the university offer, and he spoke to you about marriage. He did, Riker confirmed. I think he was trying to determine my intentions before making his decision about the position. He made it very clear that your happiness was his primary concern. And what did you tell him? She asked, curiosity mingling with the joy in her expression. I told him that I loved his daughter more than I had thought possible to love anyone, and that nothing would make me happier than to make her my wife, if you would have me. Riker's hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face. I also told him that should that happen, he would always have a home with us, whether he was leading geological surveys across the territory or eventually retiring to write his memoirs. Tears spilled over onto Violet's cheeks. No wonder he's been looking so satisfied lately. He already knew everything would work out perfectly. Not everything, Riker corrected gently. He knew my heart, but he couldn't be certain of yours. That's why he showed you the letter first, before mentioning our conversation. He wanted your decision to be entirely your own. Violet nodded, understanding her father's wisdom, and it is. Completely my own, she looked out over the valley, then back to Riker. When shall we tell him? Tonight if you wish, or tomorrow, whenever you're ready. Tonight, she decided firmly, there's no reason to wait. And then we can begin planning both for the wedding and for this. She gestured toward the valley. How soon could we start building? Riker laughed, delighted by her enthusiasm. As soon as you like. I've had ideas for a proper house for years, just never had a reason to build one before. With your input and your father's architectural knowledge, we could have plans drawn up within weeks. As the sun began to set in earnest, casting long shadows across the land that would become the foundation of their future together, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the ride back to town. The conversation now flowed freely between them, filled with plans and possibilities that neither had dared to voice before. By the time they reached the Summers' home, twilight had deepened into early evening. They found Professor Summers on the porch, apparently waiting for them, a knowing smile on his face as he observed their clasped hands and radiant expressions. I see you've had a productive ride, he commented dryly, though his eyes twinkled with approval. Father, Violet began, her voice brimming with happiness. Riker has asked me to marry him, and I have accepted. Excellent, the professor clapped his hands together in obvious satisfaction. I was beginning to wonder if I would need to engineer some new crisis to move things along. You knew, Violet accused him fondly, about everything. The university position, Riker's intentions, all of it. My dear, her father replied with exaggerated innocence. I merely created conditions in which natural processes could unfold according to their own logic, a fundamental principle of scientific observation. Riker laughed, recognizing the professor's strategic maneuvering for what it was, the actions of a man who loved his daughter enough to ensure her happiness while pursuing his own calling. Well, Professor, your experiment has yielded conclusive results. Your daughter has agreed to become my wife, and we would like your blessing. You have it most heartily, Professor Summers declared, embracing them both with genuine emotion. Nothing could please me more than seeing Violet settled with a man worthy of her, especially one who understands the importance of her father's work. Without demanding, she abandoned her own pursuits. As they entered the house to continue their discussion over a celebratory dinner, Riker found himself reflecting on the extraordinary turn his life had taken in the span of a few short weeks. The man who had once defined himself by his isolation, who had believed that connections only led to pain, now embraced a future shaped by family, commitment, and love. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. With Professor Summers departing for Helena within the month, they agreed on a simple wedding ceremony to be held in Whitewater Springs before he left. This arrangement would allow him to give Violet away before beginning his new position, with the understanding that construction on the new house would be well underway by the time he returned for his first visit. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the small community, generating a wave of goodwill that surprised Riker. Townspeople who had once regarded him as a remote, solitary figure now approached with congratulations and offers of assistance with wedding preparations. The Petersons insisted on hosting a dinner in their honor, while Mrs. Morgan, the sheriff's wife, organized a group of women to help Violet with her wedding dress. 2 weeks after Riker's proposal, on a perfect early autumn day, the church in Whitewater Springs overflowed with guests, ranchers, merchants, miners, and travelers who had come to know and respect both the scholarly professor and his daughter, as well as the once solitary rancher who had proven himself during the Harmon incident. Riker stood at the altar, dressed in a new suit that felt strangely formal after years of practical ranch wear. Sheriff Morgan stood beside him as best man, a role the older man had accepted with gruff pleasure when asked. Never thought I'd see the day, Morgan murmured as they waited for the ceremony to begin. You settling down with a wife, and an Eastern lady at that. Neither did I, Riker admitted quietly. Funny how life turns out. Not funny. Right? Morgan clapped him on the shoulder. You two fit together like puzzle pieces, anyone with eyes can see it. Before Riker could respond, the church door opened, and Violet appeared on her father's arm. The sight of her in a simple but elegant white dress, her chestnut hair crowned with wildflowers gathered from the prairie, momentarily stole his breath. As she walked toward him, her eyes never leaving his, Riker felt a certainty settle over him that transcended the nervousness of the moment. This woman, this remarkable, courageous, intelligent woman, had changed everything about how he viewed the world and his place in it. With her by his side, the future that had once seemed best faced alone now beckoned with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. The ceremony itself passed in something of a blur, though Riker would always remember the moment when Violet's clear voice promised to love and honor him for all the days of their lives, and the feeling of the simple gold band sliding onto her finger as he made the same vow in return. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Hayes declared, his voice carrying to the back of the packed church. Mr. Newell, you may kiss your bride. As Riker leaned forward to seal their union with a kiss that was both tender and promising, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Even Mrs. Peterson, known for her rigid propriety, was seen to dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. The celebration that followed at the hotel's dining room lasted well into the evening. Professor Summers gave a toast that managed to combine geological metaphors, literary references, and genuine emotional wisdom in a way that left few dry eyes in the room. Sheriff Morgan followed with a shorter but equally heartfelt tribute to the couple whose courage had brought down the Harmon gang, and whose marriage now symbolized the best of what community could mean in the sometimes harsh reality of territorial life. As the festivities continued around them, Riker and Violet found a moment of relative privacy near one of the windows overlooking the main street. Mrs. Newell, he said softly, still marveling at the reality of their union. Are you happy? Violet's smile, radiant in the lamplight, was answer enough, but she put it into words as well. Completely, are you? More than I knew was possible. He took her hand, the simple gold band on her finger catching the light. I keep thinking about that first day, how close I came to simply sending you to town with the sheriff and continuing on my solitary way. What stopped you? She asked, genuinely curious. You were so determined to maintain your isolation. What changed your mind? Riker considered the question, thinking back to that pivotal moment. It was the look in your eyes, he said finally. When you spoke about your father, when you insisted on being part of the search rather than waiting safely in town. There was something in your expression that reminded me of who I used to be before I convinced myself that caring only led to pain. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. You showed me that courage isn't about avoiding connections out of fear of loss, but about embracing them despite knowing how vulnerable they make us. That true strength lies in opening ourselves to possibilities, not closing ourselves off from them. Violet's free hand came up to rest against his cheek, a gesture that had become intimately familiar. And now I understand that what I thought was strength was actually fear, Riker admitted. And what I thought was weakness, allowing myself to care, to connect, to love, is actually the greatest strength there is. Their conversation was interrupted by Professor Summers approaching, his expression a mixture of joy and wistfulness. I hate to intrude on such a moment, but I wanted to let you know I'll be leaving for Helena on tomorrow's stage as planned. So soon, Violet's happiness dimmed slightly at the reminder of her father's imminent departure. I thought perhaps you might delay a few days, given the circumstances. My dear, the university's schedule waits for no man, not even one celebrating his daughter's marriage. He smiled, softening the statement. Besides, the sooner I begin, the sooner I can return to see the progress on your new home. He turned to Riker, extending his hand. Take care of her, son. Though I suspect it will be a mutual endeavor, with each of you caring for the other in ways I can only approve of. Riker shook his father-in-law's hand firmly. You'll always have a home with us, Professor. Whether between expeditions or whenever you decide your traveling days are done. I know, the older man nodded, genuine emotion in his eyes, and that knowledge makes this departure far less difficult than it might otherwise be. As the professor moved away to speak with other guests, Violet leaned into Riker's side, her expression pensive. I'll miss him. Of course you will, Riker agreed, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. but he'll be back before you know it, likely with enough geological samples to fill half our new house." She laughed, the momentary sadness lifting. "You're right, and in the meantime, we have a home to build and a life to begin." Together, Riker emphasized, the word carrying all the promise of their future. Together, Violet agreed, her eyes meeting his with a love that still amazed him with its depth and certainty. As they rejoined the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes from the community that had become their extended family, Riker marveled at how completely his life had transformed in the span of a few short weeks. The man who had once believed that the frontier was no place for love, that isolation was the only path to security, now stood at the center of a gathering that celebrated the very connections he had once avoided. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: a father-in-law's departure, construction plans for their home, the daily work of building a life together. But for the first time in years, Riker faced tomorrow not with resignation but with anticipation, not alone but with the woman whose courage and love had shown him that the truest strength lay in opening one's heart, not closing it. The solitary rancher who had once declared his intention to leave was gone, transformed by the look in a remarkable woman's eyes into a man who had found his true home not in isolation, but in the most profound connection of all.